Hello all, and welcome back to my weekly series, Let's Read, The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 4, which is called Where Science Meets Faith. Now, this chapter is Strobel's investigation into the relationship between science and faith. The basic proposition of this chapter is a refutation of the liberal Christian idea that science tells us about facts and theories, and religious tells us about meanings and morality. Strobel's proposition is that Christianity makes claims that are scientifically testable, and that science supports his religion. Okay, so the chapter opens with an account of a 1985 conference into science and religion. The centerpiece of this account is the story of how Alan Sandage, perhaps the greatest experimental cosmologist in the past 50 years, surprised everyone by effectively announcing that he'd converted to Christianity. And in the audience at this event was Stephen Meyer, who is the expert that Strobel interviews in this chapter. And Meyer, seeing Sandage and other scientists profess their faith, is painted as being pivotal in his Meyer's journey to a kind of theism that's entwined with science. Now, of note here is that while Strobel goes to great lengths to detail the credentials of Sandage and the other theist scientists, he curiously provides no details of the actual conference, other than that it was about the relationship between science and faith. Now, it turns out that it was titled Christianity Challenges the University, an international conference of theists and atheists, and it was sponsored by Dallas Baptist University. Now, interestingly, the only article I can find about it that was contemporaneous with the event makes no mention at all of Alan Sandage's appearance, which to me suggests that his conversion to Christianity was not big news at the time. Also, this conference, and there was a sister conference in 1983, really seem to have faded in from history. I could find almost no references to them outside of this book and websites and things quoting this book. And what this suggests to me is that Strobel wants a compelling story to introduce this chapter's expert, Meyer. And he won't let the fact that this is not a particularly compelling story get in the way of that. He will make it into the story that he wants. This is not an auspicious start to the chapter. Now, before we get into the bulk of the chapter, which is an interview with Stephen Meyer, let's look at how the conference affected Meyer's thinking. And I quote, "Meyer was intrigued. It seemed to him that the theists had the intellectual initiative in each of the three issues discussed at the conference: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the nature of human consciousness. Even skeptics on the panels conceded the shortcomings of naturalistic explanations. Their main response was only to challenge the theists to provide scientific answers, instead of merely invoking the idea of intelligent design." This is supposed to sound like a victory for intelligent design, but to me it sounds more like Meyer misunderstanding science. The skeptics on the panel were honest about the limitations of current scientific explanations. That in itself is not an argument for design. And the insistence on scientific ideas is not an unjustified bias against design. It's a consequence of the vague and unfalsifiable ideas that always fall under this umbrella term of design. For design to be a useful hypothesis, the term would need to be defined in clear and unambiguous terms. I'll be keeping an eye out in this chapter to see if Strobel or Meyer can actually do that. Okay, so now we get into the actual interview. But before we get to that, Strobel spends a couple of pages detailing the impressive academic credentials of Meyer, particularly his degrees in science and his PhD in history of science from Cambridge. He lists what seems to be his entire publication record and all of the universities he's ever spoken at, all the debates he's had, and all of the media that he's appeared in. And look, I can appreciate biographical detail, but none of this is particularly interesting in itself. It's just long lists of, and he published this, and he published this, and he published this. And it really just seems to be setting us up for to try and get us to accept Meyer's authority on things. Unfortunately for Strobel, at the end, he mentions that Meyer works for the Discovery Institute, the headquarters of the intelligent design movement. And on balance, I find that the impressive credentials on one hand and his dubious religious convictions kind of balance out. So to me, I guess I'll just have to judge him based on the arguments that he actually presents. So, We start by inquiring into whether science is the only source of knowledge, and Maya responds with this, and I quote, "While I certainly respect science, I don't believe scientific knowledge necessarily takes precedence over other things that we know. For instance, Moreland has argued that there are some things we know more certainly through introspection than we know from the sciences. I know I have free will on the basis of my introspection, and no studies in the social sciences will convince me otherwise." There are two major problems with this. The first is the misrepresentation of what science actually is. The underlying here is that there is scientific knowledge and there is knowledge that comes from other sources. Now, this concept of science holds that science is a prescribed methodology. It's a particular way of doing things, and it's being laid down and you can't change it. Yeah, there's science. If you do that, that's science. Anything else is not science. And this is simply false. At its most basic, science is what we happen to call the methods that we have come to that best allow us to arrive at knowledge of the world. It's not that we hold to the idea that these are the best ways. It's that when we look for the best ways, we lump them together and we call that science. There was never a preordained list of methods that science must use. Only an attempt to be as objective as possible about what works. What we call science is just those methods that we've found are most reliable. This leaves open the possibility that there may be better ways of doing things, but it also acknowledges that all the other methods we've tried, like faith, emotion, divine revelation, are not good ways of finding out about the world. The second problem with what Maya is saying here is that the idea that introspection, in particular, is a reliable method of divining truth, and that's not correct. It's been demonstrated repeatedly in a variety of domains. At best, introspection can tell us about our thought processes, and even this is notoriously unreliable. To argue that we must have free will on the basis of our internal subjective experiences of it has been rejected by almost every philosopher and scientist who has given the idea any thought. The only people who hold to this kind of simplistic argument for free will are those people who have religious beliefs that require free will. Maya then goes on to argue that rather than science and faith being in conflict, or that they don't overlap, that actually modern scientific results actually point to the existence of a God. And I quote, "If it's true there's a beginning to the universe, as modern cosmologists now agree, then this implies a cause that transcends the universe. If the laws of physics are fine-tuned to permit life, as contemporary physicists are discovering, then perhaps there's a designer who fine-tuned them. If there's information in the cell, as molecular biology shows, then this suggests intelligent design. And to get life going in the first place would have required biological information. The implications point beyond the material realm to a prior intelligent cause." Again, there are two major problems with this intelligent design argument. Firstly, they're all arguments from ignorance. At best, none of them actually show that intelligent design is itself a viable hypothesis, just that there's not a naturalistic explanation so far. None of these arguments actually posit anything about the nature of this intelligent designer, nor the methods by which intelligent design was produced, and rarely are testable hypotheses made based on the sort of existence of an intelligent designer. And when they are, they're found to be false. The second major problem with those intelligent design arguments is that even if they did point to intelligent design, it's just assumed that any such design must be the result of the same entity. That the universe may have a transcendent cause really in no way suggests that that cause also stepped in to produce the first life form on Earth, and then stepped in to put information in cells, and then stepped into the evolutionary process to guide it. Now, some people would say, oh, well, what about Occam's razor? But based on a completely non-understanding of how any of these things work, it's much too hasty to be applying Occam's razor at this point. Sure, in some ways it's more likely that a patient with a number of symptoms has one disease causing all of those symptoms, but it is hasty to rule out the possibility that there are multiple diseases there, and the same in this case. Okay. But rather than actually try and defend the ideas of intelligent design, at this point, Maya just wants to first show that science and religion are actually in conflict. He does this by or at least potentially in conflict. And he does this by arguing against the non-overlapping magisteria idea of Stephen Jay Gould, otherwise known as NOMA or NOMA. And I quote, Noma says science is the realm of facts and religion is the realm of morality and faith. The essential problem is that the biblical religion makes very specific claims about facts. It makes claims about the universe having a beginning, about God playing a role in creation, about humans having a certain kind of nature, and about historical events that are purported to have happened in time and space. And on this, I actually agree with Maya. Religions may primarily concern themselves with morality and faith, but they base their authority to make these pronouncements on claims about reality. The only reason that we should take the absurd teachings of Jesus seriously is that if he was actually the Son of God. And the only reason to believe that he was the Son of God is if there is good evidence for it. I don't believe there is. Strobel's yet to actually present any, but I'm willing to be shown. Maya then goes on to argue that Noma results in the reduction of Christianity to a mere matter of faith or comfort. And to a large extent, I would agree. He then goes on to argue in one brief paragraph that science and religion actually support each other rather than being in conflict. And I quote, "I believe that the testimony of science supports theism. While there will always be points of tension or unresolved conflict, the major developments in science in the past 5 decades have been running in a strongly theistic direction. Science, done right, points toward God." Philosophically, this doesn't make sense. What he's saying is that science and religion aren't in conflict, but only because, on his account, scientific results agree with his religion. He would have to concede that science, therefore, is in conflict with the numerous other religions that disagree with his. I mean, for example, the fact that cosmology apparently points to the beginning of a beginning of the universe might agree with his religion, but it disagrees with all those religions that think that time is cyclical. I mean, essentially, Maya is saying that science supports theism only because his religion happens to be true. Also note that he is implicitly accepting that religion is unreliable as a method for finding truth. I mean, he's suggesting that we should accept theism on the basis of scientific results. Accepting religious ideas should only be accepted when they agree with science. And for someone who is purporting to offer a new philosophy of science and religion, this is just the conflict between science and religion being papered over with the idea that his religion happens to be true. Okay, after that brief foray into what should be the bulk of this chapter but isn't, Strobel asked Maya for 6 results from science that supports theism. And Maya lists arguments from cosmology, physics, astronomy, biochemistry, biology, and human consciousness. And not coincidentally, this coincides exactly with the next 6 chapters of this book. Maya then goes on in some length but without much detail to give an overview of those 6 arguments. And I have objections to each of them. But I'm going to spend the next 6 chapters looking at them and critiquing them in detail. And so I'm not actually going to cover that chunk of this chapter because it's coming later. And I'll wait till then to actually explain my objections and see whether Strobel actually has any kind of answer to them. So, after that overview of what's coming next in the next 6 chapters, Strobel and Maya return again to philosophy. And they want for a discussion of the required standards of evidence for God. And so how much evidence should we actually require in order to conclude that God is real, say? And he starts with an overview of the various standards of proof required in the legal system, which seems to be a perennial preoccupation for apologists. Books such as Evidence That Demands a Verdict and Darwin on Trial. I can only surmise that perhaps apologists like the legal standards for proof because they're often much lower than that which we require in science. Anyway, Maya talks about different philosophies regarding how much evidence for God should be required, ranging on one hand from fideism, which says that you can't have any evidence at all, and that belief should be on faith alone, blind faith, through all the way then to a sort of a Cartesian approach that demands absolute proof. That the only acceptable proof of God would be a deductive proof of God's existence. Interestingly in here is Maya slips in a statement that says that deductive proofs for God's existence are impossible, meaning that he must reject the ontological argument, as well as some presuppositional arguments which claim to give exactly that. Now, it's interesting to me because apologists rarely reject other apologists' arguments, and And I'm not sure whether he realises that he's categorically denied some of the arguments that other apologists are using. Anyway, he skips over those, and we get to this. We have a brief introduction to something called abductive reasoning, and why Meyer thinks this can be used to argue for theism. So basically, abductive reasoning is a form of non-deductive reasoning. Some people say it's separate from, I tend to think of it really just as a subcategory of inductive reasoning. And the basic form is this. A implies B, therefore A is possible. Less formally, the idea is that if we observe an effect A, and if explanation A being true would explain B, then it could be reasonable to accept that explanation A is a possibility. And usually for any effect B, there are multiple possible A's that could explain B. And we need to choose between them. And this is where abductive reasoning becomes quite problematic. The usual statement is that we reason to the best explanation. The problem being that the concept of best explanation can be abused, basically, to reach any conclusion we want. Typical example of abductive reasoning is I walk outside in the morning and I see that the ground is wet. That's the effect. And I reason that if it rained, then the ground being wet would be a perfectly reasonable conclusion, i.e. rain causes the ground to be wet. And on the basis of that, I go from ground being wet to say, well, it's quite possible that it rained. That's a reasonable thing. But there are other possible explanations. It could be that somebody's just been watering the ground with a hose. It could be that there's dew on the ground. And so to distinguish which is the best explanation, we actually need more information than that. Meyer says, the way you discriminate between the competing hypotheses is to look at their explanatory power, by which he means that how much of the effect B can be explained by the explanation A. And he says, and when we look at the evidence I've mentioned from cosmology, physics, biology, and human consciousness, we find that theism has amazing explanatory scope and power. The existence of God explains this broad range of evidence more simply, adequately, and comprehensively than any other worldview, including its main competitors, naturalism or pantheism. Now, the problem with this is that theism actually has terrible explanatory power. Why did God create the universe? How did God create the universe? What was the actual mechanism? Why did he create life in the universe? How did he do that? How does he intervene in evolution? Theism, Christianity in particular, provides no answers to those questions, none at all. Now, individual Christians may, but the fact that isn't anything close to a consensus amongst Christians about these answers to these things shows that how little explanatory power theism actually has. Also, in science, explanatory power is closely linked to predictive power. That is, the amount of falsifiable predictions that an explanation makes. For example, the ground is wet. Now, one possible hypothesis is God made the ground wet. How can we check? Don't know. Another hypothesis, possible putative explanation A, which has predictive power, is that it rained. Because if it rained, not only would that make the ground wet, but it would also make other things wet. Okay? Or it would make it like there might be clouds in the sky. Or that if I checked the weather forecast, the weather report, that it would say that it had rained. Now, all of these things are predictions based on if it rained, then I would see these things, and I can go and check them. And if I find they're false, then I can know that that particular prediction, that explanation probably is wrong. If somebody was watering using the hose, then the hose should be in some condition. I might be able to find somebody who is out there. That's what it means to make predictive predictions, and to have explanatory power is closely linked to that idea of predictive power. And the problem with Christianity is that the predictions it makes about the universe are generally false. Meyer lists the areas of science that are reputedly in agreement with theism, but he omits the glaring contradictions between what the Bible says should be and what we know about the world. I mean, the Genesis account, or even accounts of creation, are flatly wrong. The history in the Old Testament is wrong. The miracles of the New Testament didn't happen. We know this. So while theism may accord with some aspects of modern science, the theism that does is not the theism of Christianity. Look, on a related note, if an intelligent designer or God did intervene at specific times in the universe's history, what predictions could we make from this? Even if God did create the universe, create life, intervene in evolution, and ensure human consciousness, since we can have no idea about why or how that occurred, we can make no predictions. Look, as another analogy, suppose the police are called to a death, whereupon they determine the victim was killed using supernatural means by a supernatural being who has desires incomprehensible to us. Just grant me for the time being that they somehow managed to determine this without, right. So they know that to be true. That explanation, it may explain the death of this person perfectly. It may accord with all the known facts, but it gives us no insight into where, when, or how it may kill again. This is a situation with the God hypothesis. Even if it perfectly accounts for all these anomalous findings in science, it provides no predictions about what or how God will intervene in the future. Except, of course, for all the failed predictions that Christianity's already made. Okay, so, after talking about the explanatory power of theism, Strobel proposes some objections to Maya. Now, the first question is, why? If the scientific evidence is pointing to theism, why are not more scientists theists? This is a good question, and the obvious answer is that the experts simply aren't convinced by the arguments that Maya is advancing. But this isn't Maya's answer. He firstly argues that scientists are often experts in their own field, and that therefore they would be unaware of advances in other fields. And look, this is true. But it still doesn't explain why the majority of experts in the fields that he's actually listed also haven't been converted. I mean, despite his claim that cosmology supports theism, very, very few cosmologists are convinced of that. So to explain this, Maya argues that the scientific community is hostile to religion. Of course, this is unsupported by research, and it misses the huge number of religious universities and the roughly half of research scientists who are in themselves religious. He also takes this opportunity to once more assert that naturalism is the dogma of science and that intelligent design advocates are persecuted for dissenting. He elaborates, within the scientific culture, there are belief systems that are philosophically very questionable. For instance, many believe that science must only allow naturalistic explanations, which excludes from consideration the design hypothesis. Many scientists put blinders on, refusing to acknowledge that evidence and a kind of groupthink develops. The beauty of this accusation, the accusation that non-religious scientists are biased, is that literally one paragraph later he says this: motives are irrelevant to assessing the validity of scientific theories. You have to respond to the evidence or argument that's being offered, regardless of who offers it or why. If every person in the intelligent design movement were a fundamentalist who attends Baptist Bible Church, it wouldn't matter. Their arguments have to be weighed on their merits. So nicely, on one hand, he wants to argue that non-religious scientists are biased against supernatural explanations, and then in almost the same breath, he wants to defend intelligent design advocates from the same claims. He then goes on to argue that perhaps religious scientists are religious because of the evidence from science. This is an attempt to have it both ways. Like, he wants to argue that there's many scientists who aren't religious, and he wants to argue that they have those beliefs for irrational reasons. But all those religious scientists, they have their beliefs for completely rational reasons, without providing any evidence for that. And this is naked bias by Strobel and Maya, who just want to think theism is rational and atheism is irrational, and just want to put that on us. So, Strobel concludes this section with Maya laying out his manifesto for improving science. I don't think it's right to invoke a self-serving rule that says only naturalistic explanations can be considered by science. Let's have a new period in the history of science where we have methodological rules that actually foster the unfettered seeking of truth. Scientists should be allowed to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads to a conclusion that makes some people uncomfortable. Now, for a historian of science, Maya gets this very wrong. Science's methodological naturalism is not a self-serving rule imposed by atheists to avoid supernatural explanations, but rather it's a guideline imposed by Christians. Scientists dating back, at the time they weren't called scientists, dating back to the 12th century. Christians in the 12th century were arguing for methodological naturalism. as a way of enabling science to function. It's an assumption that is amply justified by the outstanding successes of science in explaining the world, and one that could be easily dismissed by showing a single, unambiguous example of a phenomenon that cannot be accounted for naturalistically. The best that any theists have ever managed is refer to miracles for which there is no good evidence, or point to things that science has yet to explain and assert that somehow they cannot be explained. And that's it. That's all the evidence they've ever given. Given the amazing advances that science has made, we should not give up methodological naturalism on some kind of false appeal to fairness. Strobel now introduces the idea of dysteleology, and as far as I can tell, misspells it in his book. That is, dysteleology is the argument from poor design. This is the argument that says that since there are imperfections in the design of living organisms, they can't have been designed by a perfect designer. Perfect designer equals perfect creation. Creation isn't perfect, therefore not perfect designer. This wouldn't be a problem for intelligent design if it wasn't actually a stalking horse for Christianity. I mean, the various imperfections are not necessarily an argument against an intelligent designer, who is powerful, but not perfect. But Strobel and Meyer are arguing for a Christian God, so of course they have to address this. So, it's Strobel here playing the devil's advocate, and he introduces the various oddities of the human eye. So the vertebrate eye, of which humans are one, is quite odd in that the light-sensitive cells in the retina are actually behind the nerve cells and blood vessels, and this impairs the quality of vision that we have. And all vertebrates, I believe. And it also requires a blind spot where the nerve cells pass through the retina, so we have blind spots in each of our eyes. Now, also, due to the way the optics work, I believe, the image on the retina is actually upside down. And so our brain has to do all of this processing to flip the image, to smooth it out and to improve its quality. And so all of these sort of oddities combined with a really well-documented pathway by which the eye has evolved to have these oddities. So we understand why the eye has evolved to have these oddities. There's a straightforward evolutionary explanation for it. So all of that is pretty strong evidence against intelligent design in the eye. But Meyer disagrees. There's an important physiological reason as to why the retina has to be inverted in the eye. It's a trade-off that allows the eye to process the vast amount of oxygen it needs in vertebrates. Yes, this creates a slight blind spot, but that's not a problem because people have two eyes and the two blind spots don't overlap. Actually, the eye is an incredible design, but the fact that we can cope with or will compensate for our blind spots doesn't actually make blind spots good design. Okay, so Meyer then goes on to make a broader point that things that look like bad design could be explained as simply trade-offs between competing priorities. He elaborates by discussing his laptop. You could look at the screen and say, bad design, it should have been bigger. You could look at memory and say, bad design, should have had a larger capacity. You could look at the keyboard and say, bad design, should have been easier to use. But the engineer isn't supposed to be creating the best screen, the best memory, and the best keyboard. He's supposed to be producing the best computer he can, given certain size, weight, price, and portability requirements. Could the screen be bigger? Yes, but then portability suffers. Could the computer have more memory? Sure, but then the cost goes too high. Ironically, Meyer's analogy here exposes the flaw in using intelligent design to try and prove the Christian God. Firstly, there should be none of these trade-offs necessary to an all-powerful creator God. The Christian God is not constrained in the same way the human engineer is. The God of Christianity is powerful enough to avoid almost all constraints. And so the Christian God really, his job is, if he is perfectly good and perfectly powerful and all the rest of it that Christians like to think of it, he should be trying to create the best creature. Secondly, let's consider a laptop from 1990 compared to a laptop from 2010. What would we see? Well, the newer laptop would probably be better in every single respect. It would be more powerful, it would be lighter, cheaper, more reliable, and have longer battery life. What we can infer from this is the designers in 1990 didn't have access to the same materials and methods as the designers in 2010. So let's return to the eye. We know that eyes have evolved. in the sense that they've gotten better over time. And we also know that older eyes are generally inferior to newer eyes in the fossil record. So, in the animal kingdom, there are eyes that are clearly superior to other eyes in every way. If we look back to some of the earliest eyes that creatures ever evolved, they are inferior to the relatively modern camera eyes of some creatures. Some of them, not all of them. I mean, there are trade-offs and fit for purpose and all the rest of it, but there are some eyes that are just clearly not as good. This makes no sense if the intelligent designer is the Christian God. Like, in order for intelligent design to make sense, either the designer is getting better over time and therefore able to produce better eyes, or the designer just isn't interested in or capable of optimal design. Either the designer doesn't care about making good eyes particularly, or makes good eyes only later, or isn't able to make perfect eyes. Also, Strobel uses the example of the eye, which Maya has a somewhat reasonable response to, but there are even more blatant examples of bad design. I mean, the first one that I always think of is the routing of the vas deferens in men. So the vas deferens is a tube that carries sperm from the testicles. Okay. Now, instead of taking a direct route out of the testes, it actually loops up and over the urethra before coming down again. And this makes no sense from a design point of view. There is no reason for it to loop up and over. It could just go straight to where it needs to get. But it's readily explained by as being an unfortunate byproduct of the evolution of having external testicles. So the testicles grow inside the abdomen and descend. The problem is that as it descends, they have, I think it's the urethra, as it descends, it goes the wrong side of the urethra and the vas deferens gets trapped over it, rather than it going in front of, say, I think it goes behind and it gets trapped. Yeah. Instead of going in front, which would require the vas deferens to not have to loop over it. Now, there's a similar example which is in some ways even worse, and that's the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Now, this is a branch of a nerve that goes from the brain to the larynx. So it goes from the base of your brain up in here to your throat, which is a distance I think, a direct distance of about 10 centimetres. But instead of going the direct path, the nerve goes from the skull, from your brain, all the way down your neck to your heart. It then loops around your aorta and comes all the way back up your neck to your larynx. This is an absurd route for it to take. It is particularly inefficient in giraffes, where this nerve, that nerve itself, is approximately 4.5 meters long. It is twice as long as necessary. So instead of going from the giraffe's head to the giraffe's throat, it goes all the way down the giraffe's neck to the heart, loops around, it comes all the way back up to the throat. Now, there are fantastic evolutionary explanation for this. We know how this evolved to be exactly how it is, and it makes complete sense on an evolutionary point of view. It makes no sense at all from an intelligent design point of view, and it's strong evidence in favour of evolution rather than design. And it's funny how neither Strobel nor Maya deigns to mention this. Anyway, Maya then goes on to address Stephen Jay Gould's criticism of intelligent design based on the design of the panda's thumb. And he says, well, experts on the panda say it's a pretty efficient way of scraping the bark off bamboo. In the absence of a standard of good design, which Gould can't provide, it's really hard to say whether it's good or bad. It seems to perform its function exceedingly well. Did you catch that? Maya has accepted that there are no standards for good or bad design, apparently. But it seems to me that distinguishing good design from bad design is actually relatively simple. And the kind of thing that we do all the time in other fields of human endeavour, from architecture to all kinds of engineering to... we are quite capable of determining whether something is a relatively good design or bad design. See, the problem is this. For something to be designed, it essentially implies that it has some intended purpose. That's kind of what we mean by design. So an architect who designs a house designs it with the purpose of human habitation in mind, a particular kind of habitation. And sometimes in the intelligent design circles, this is called specified complexity. That is, that there's a specification that it's supposed to be meeting up to. Now, once you have identified something as designed, whether it's well-designed or poorly designed is simply a matter of assessing how fit it is for the purpose that you've determined. That is, Look, deciding whether something is designed is far more difficult than determining whether a designed thing is well designed. By saying it's really hard to determine good design from bad design, Ms. Meyer is really just conceding that the real problem here is determining whether something is designed based only on its appearance. I mean, once you know that a panda's thumb is designed for scraping bark, right? Let's say, if we did manage to determine that it was designed, then it's easy to work out how well designed it is. You just look at the efficiency of it. How well does it serve its purpose? And so when he says, yes, Gould can't really point out that it's bad design because Gould doesn't provide a standard, what he's really saying is there aren't any standards by which we can infer design. These standards simply don't exist. That might sound odd because it seems intuitive that we should be able to infer design from things, but actually, this is our cognitive biases at seeing agency and intention in things for which it doesn't exist. And when we drill down to it, when you think about it deeply, which a lot of people have, there really is no good, no objective way of saying when we see this, it means that it's designed, and when we don't see it, it means it's not designed. Anyway, next, Meyer goes on to argue that poor design isn't really a problem for the Christian God anyway, because the Bible makes it clear that God's creation isn't perfect, because evil entered the world through sin. Now, this is quite a common Christian dodge. And look, I'm not particularly interested in theology, but I would just like to point out here that this is an open admission that God cannot be all-powerful, perfectly good, and all-knowing, since having these attributes actually means he could have prevented this terrible state of affairs, and that he should have wanted to. So whenever Christians sort of say, the Bible does say that, creation has been corrupted by man and free will and sin and whatever, they are implicitly acknowledging that God isn't all-powerful, perfectly good, and all-knowing, that one of those things can't be true. All right, next section. Strobel now starts to get a bit giddy at the thought of overturning scientific consensus about naturalistic science, and he starts to look forward to interviewing all his experts that he's got to come. It's at this point that I've realised that we're about to finish chapter 4, and all we've had so far is a takedown of 4 images, and some half-hearted attempts to convince us that methodological naturalism is an unfair attempt to disbar God from science. And that's all we've had. We've had several hints of the content to come, and it just seems to me that Strobel is repeatedly mentioning these arguments as an attempt to soften us up for the coming chapters, by introducing and mentioning all of these highly credentialed theistic sciences, but not actually advancing any decent arguments yet. It really just seems like an attempt to reduce any skeptical tendencies we might have before we get to the actual meat of the book. Also, it could just be padding so that the book looks longer. Anyway, the chapter's almost over. Strobel decides to cap it off with a discussion of Meyer's personal journey to God. It's not particularly convincing, but it does give us insight into how to do atheism poorly. Meyer says, "One thing I haven't told you about my spiritual journey is that for a 2-year period in my life, I was very attracted to Nietzsche's version of existentialism. Nietzsche had a different objection than the ones we've been talking about. He asked, 'Why should God rule and I serve?' This resonated with me. Why should a condition of my happiness be submission to the will of God? I sensed I couldn't be happy without him. I knew my bad lifestyle only brought misery. So I ended up literally shaking my fist at God in a wheat field in Washington State." It's not clear whether Meyer was ever an atheist, but this passage does seem to be included to prove that Meyer at least, strongly railed against Christianity. It's just that this is hardly the objections to God that I and many other atheists actually have. It just doesn't seem relevant other than to try and paint some picture of Meyer as he's thought deeply about the issues or something. And he mentions Nietzsche, so he must be well read or something. I'm glad that the Christian God doesn't exist, because I find the biblical God to be undeserving of all worship. But look, my non-belief and the non-belief of many other people that I've come in contact with is based on evidence, not emotion. Okay, so the chapter wraps up with a blatant attempt to shift the burden of proof. Quote, "Exploring the scientific and historical evidence for God is a way of giving the Creator the credit and honour and glory that are due to him. To attribute creation to a mere natural process is a form of idolatry to which we are all prone. All of us have a tendency to minimise God, to think and behave as if we weren't really immersed in his creation. Looking at the evidence in nature and in scripture reminds me over and over again of who he is. And it reminds me of who I am too, someone in need of him. Okay, so part of this is just an attempt to suggest that the naturalistic worldview is somehow more intuitive, and that we need to work to bring ourselves to see agency in the world. And this is simply incorrect for most people. I mean, the utter popularity of religion in general, as well as a lot of results from psychology, show that people readily subscribe to a view of the world that is anything but naturalistic. A naturalistic worldview has been fought for, tooth and nail, by scientific advances. People have always been skeptical of naturalistic explanations, and they've always needed overwhelming evidence to convince them. And what Strobel is doing here is trying to make a virtue of faith and superstition, and condemn empiricism as a human foible. The best thing about this is the final appeal to scripture right at the end of the chapter. Okay, so where are we now? Well, this chapter has been disappointing. I've noticed that Strobel is poor at organising his content. The topics covered move all over the place through the chapters, with some topics spilling over into multiple sections. Other equally important topics get shoved together in a single section. Mixed into the purportedly evidence-based arguments are stories about people's journeys to and from faith. Many theistic experts are cited with scant regard to giving a balanced review. Strobel himself takes the role of skeptic, but due to his lack of either expertise or motivation, his objections are weak and what we Australians might call Dorothy Dixes. We've had 4 chapters so far, and we haven't had any actual evidence for creation, only attacks on the 4 images of evolution. Not evolution itself, just 4 images, and attacks on methodological naturalism. It feels like he's hoping that we've been impressed by his assertions and the endless parade of theistic scientists, that we'll be left feeling that he's made his case, even though we can't really remember him having done it. Still, the next 6 chapters are set aside for him to really make his case for creation, and although I'm utterly unconvinced so far, maybe that'll change in the next chapter. His expert for next chapter is William Lane Craig, and if anyone convinced me, surely he can. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think. I'll see you next week for chapter 5. See ya.